Good morning, Minneapolis, and welcome to the Chipstone discussion. Yes, she can. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Leslie Ferrin, a specialist in ceramic art, director of both Ferrin Contemporary and our residency program, Project Art, based in Western Massachusetts. For 40 years, I have worked with hundreds of women, artists, art professionals, and collectors. I've mentored many young women who continue to remind me of how far we've come since I began in 1979 as a producing artist and part of an all-female cooperative studio. What you're watching is a series of images I chose to set the stage for today's important conversation, reignited by the Me Too movement. In 1991, at the 25th NCECA conference in Tempe, Arizona, I was among hundreds who participated and gathered for a panel, The Gender Factor, a forum on issues relating to gender and its impact on artistic expression and professional development. At that same conference, there were multiple panels and lectures that dealt with the devastating impact of AIDS on the arts community, the role of the NEA, and the ongoing culture wars. The closing lecture was presented by the Guerrilla Girls. The Gender Factor was organized by Coil Hooven, a sculptor and self-supporting potter who harnessed the ideas and momentum of gender-based discrimination and professional challenges. She dared herself and all involved to be and become a famous female artist. Sadly, she's unable to join us today, but others who participated are here at the conference, Judith Schwartz, Marge Levy, and myself. During these 18 years that followed, Hooven took her own advice and 10 years ago turned her focus on her own artistic legacy. With the help of archivist Farrell Mertes, their steady effort resulted in 2 solo museum exhibitions and multiple permanent collection acquisitions of her feminist sculpture in public collections throughout the USA and Canada. Many of her professional achievements were firsts for women. She was the first woman on the factory floor at Kohler's Arts and Industry program and the first woman to work with Yixing clay in newly opened China. By no means were these achievements unusual, nor terribly difficult, but they were firsts for women who were absolutely delighted by these opportunities and newfound freedom. It was their efforts that broke glass ceilings, laid the groundwork, and began the process of leveling this professional playing field. What is taken for granted today was hard-earned by Hooven and the other women who gathered in 1991 to bring these issues into the open and provide mentorship to the next generation in the breakout groups, myself included. Did they succeed? Clearly not, if we're still here talking about it, but clearly yes, if you consider how far we've come. Did they accept harassing behavior, put up with lower prices for their work, accept lower and unequal pay as teachers? Did they take part-time positions so they could juggle their unpaid roles, single parenthood, and caring for aging parents? Yes, they did accept less. They found workarounds and were enablers to men in a system that allowed this behavior to take place that is now considered completely unacceptable. Women like Hooven were self-employed, and there were no protections built into her career. No H&R department to complain to. Equal pay for artwork was secondary to just finding a market and getting the work sold at all. However, those compromises do not diminish the hard-earned success, nor obscure the groundbreaking work that paved the way to today, when it's finally okay to say out loud what they couldn't when they were the age of the women who are attending NCECA today. 70% of NCECA's membership is women. Let that sink in. Even in an organization and in a field with these kinds of statistics, women are still experiencing discrimination every day in the workplace, markets, academia, and still must tolerate rather than confront these problems to maintain positions and continue their careers. But the good news is, for today's female artists, it's good for your career to identify as a feminist, and it's beneficial to define and promote your successes. For both women and culturally diverse artists, it is a time to rewrite the history, fill in the gaps in public and private collections, and take advantage of restated priorities that now favor diversity. It's about time, and I am enjoying watching the measurable success. And now, I would like to introduce our moderator. Rebecca Sive is an inspirational and powerful speaker on women, leadership, and noted among feminists who changed America. Her career has spanned executive positions in business, government, philanthropy, academia, and the not-for-profit sector. The author of 2 books and dozens of articles, Rebecca's most recent book, Vote Her In, Your Guide to Electing Our First Women President, is a graphic and practical handbook explaining why we should elect Madam President in 2020 and how every woman can take part in achieving that success and benefiting from it. Rebecca is an avid collector of contemporary ceramics by American women and recently wrote and published a book on her collection of Linda Sikora's work. Rebecca's commitment to women ceramicists was recently the subject of a feature story in American Craft. This morning, you will see why I enjoyed over 25 years of conversations with my friend and colleague who shares my passion for women artists by using the power we all hold to support their creative process by choosing to buy their work. I introduce Rebecca Sive.
Thanks again to the Chipstone Foundation. Thanks to our panelists, to NCECA, to Josh and Rhonda for thinking about this, and the board for committing to this, what I hope will be an ongoing process of discussion among all of us about why it's so important for all of us to be engaged, not only as potters or sculptors, but as women and men in pursuing justice in the ceramics world. I'll just start by giving you a sense of our purpose this morning and our format. So, you've heard Leslie, and there were these 2 sets of opening remarks, one by her, one by me, and then we're going to go to our wonderful panel, and I will introduce them when we get to that point, who've thought about this a great deal, care about this a great deal, and I'm just so pleased that they're here. And they will each do a more or less 7-minute presentation. I think you're going to find these presentations both very educational and provocative, each from their particular perspective in this world, which complements each other. And then we'll have a bit of a dialogue among the panel and myself, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A, and then at the conclusion at 10:30, as I mentioned, thank everyone again and have the book signing. So the purpose here, I want to be clear on this because in the process of working on this panel, there's 2 pieces to this. One is the sort of collective institutional experience that we experience as parts of institutions or not, and a different experience is our experience as individual women who may have experienced or continue to experience discrimination or bigger problems like assault, or not bigger problems, but different problems. And so what we collectively decided to do and asked NCECA to do, and I thank Josh and Holly and Rhonda for that, is to divide our discussion today into 2 parts. So today we're going to focus this morning on the sort of institutional aspects and how those relate to our lives as collectors, as potters, as professors, as enthusiasts. And then later this afternoon at 1:30, Anne is going to lead a session. And for those who want to share personal stories in a safe environment with other women, that is your time to do so. I'm really pleased that we were able to make that happen with Josh and Rhonda's significant support. And so while I encourage you to share your thoughts in the Q&A, we really wanted to have this 2-fold opportunity. And so feel free. I believe that other session will be at 1:30. And those of you who may want to be a part of that, please participate. And of course, Anne with her wonderful pink hair, you can't miss her, right? She can tell you more about what the plan is for that after the session. So I want to go now to my own opening remarks. And I guess what I want to say as a preface to this is I was trained as a historian. I was also trained as a community organizer in the Alinsky mode of organizing. Some people like that, some people don't. I also am a New Yorker by birth. I grew up in a very political family, and the commitment, we all have our faults. Certainly I have plenty, but the commitment in my family and in my life has not only been to do as we all do, which is work hard, have a wonderful family, hopefully succeed, but to pursue social justice, and in my particular case, justice for women. And so you'll hear that I'm pretty frank in these remarks, and these remarks are taken from the essay that's in your catalog, so there are also essays from the other panelists. So I'm going to speak frankly, both because I'm speaking from the heart when I do that, and also because I do want us to sort of get at what we're dealing with. And so here we are. When I was invited to lead this conference panel, I renewed my discussions with others, both within the ceramics community and without, about the Me Too movement and its significance. Since I'm a historian of American social and political history, as well as an organizer of political movements myself, these discussions were framed by my understanding that 2019 is a unique year in American history in the context of female-male relations. For in 2019, gender and power dynamics will play out as they never have before, affecting each of us living in the United States as never before. For in 2019, for the first time in American history, several women are seeking the major political party nomination for President of the United States. These women are following in the footsteps of the courageous women who preceded them, including in 2016, as we all know, Hillary Clinton, the first woman presidential candidate nominated by a major political party. In 1972, Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman member of Congress, was the first African-American to seek a major political party presidential nomination and have her name placed in nomination. She then went back to Congress and only hired women on her staff. I mean, I know y'all have heard of Shirley and what a role model she is. Preceding her in 1964, the name of Margaret Chase Smith, Republican U.S. Senator of Maine, was placed in nomination at the Republican Convention. And way back in the day, there was Victoria Woodhull, a free love advocate, so-called, so named, who in the late 1800s ran for the presidency on the ticket of the so-called Equal Rights Party. This was almost 50 years before women were granted the federal franchise. Along with Frederick Douglass, who I'm sure you all know too, the anti-slavery advocate born in slavery, as her vice presidential running mate. So there is an amazing tradition in American history I hope we can all learn to appreciate more, because a lot of it is hidden, about the roles that courageous women and people of color have played in moving our country forward. This history is not only of importance to political junkies or political science professors or history buffs, it is of singular importance to every one of us as we now experience this historic year. So let's consider what the duties of POTUS actually are, and then take that understanding and think about how this position description, this job description, relates to our experience of executives in the ceramics world, for it does profoundly. What does POTUS do? In ordinary times, POTUS, yeah, we can laugh about it, but we can cry too, I guess. What does POTUS do? In ordinary times, POTUS embodies U.S. national values for the rest of the world of freedom and democracy, however flawed our history may have is. Affirms the beliefs our nation was founded on, liberty and justice for all, and typifies personal behavior to emulate. At the same time as POTUS undertakes these executive duties, she decides how to spend trillions of dollars, appoints thousands of people to positions of power and influence, and makes decisions, sometimes unilaterally, through the mechanism of executive orders and the bully pulpit. So let's extrapolate from the president's job description to consider the executive and administrative powers possessed by the predominantly male bosses of the ceramics world. Think about your university or college art department. Think about your local arts center or museum or ceramics residency program. Think about the associations of professionals in ceramics and the arts in which you participate. Who runs most of these institutions? Who possesses the executive responsibilities in them so akin to those of the president in kind, if not in magnitude? What unique administrative, policy-making, political, and financial decision-making powers do these primarily male bosses have? What messages do they choose to articulate and share via their decisions about the art they select to exhibit or sell or the people they hire? Whose values and goals do they articulate to aspiring ceramists? Whom do they choose to help them govern? What deleterious personal behaviors do too many of them feel free to engage in with impunity? Think about the number of women ceramics professors versus male ceramics professors with tenure. Think about this cumulatively over the time you may have been teaching in the field or working in the field or looking for a job in the field. Think about the number of women professors in your department who could seek to lead it. And that likely cannot include those many women adjuncts or others on short-term contracts. Think about the proportion of male versus female winners of awards, fellowships, and residencies you and your colleagues have applied for. And finally, think about those women potters you know who have ceased to engage institutionally at all. Perhaps they now pursue a solo studio practice. Perhaps you're one of them. Perhaps they now live and work out in the country, far removed from the daily invidious sexism of male-run ceramics institutions. So let's talk about this daily sexism and worse, abusive behavior that far too many women ceramists experience in the workplace. I see it this way. This institutionalized sexism has little to do with sexuality or sex and everything to do with the imbalance of power generally in our culture, exacerbated by the continuing prevalence of men in executive positions in places where women labor and are therefore beholden to male bosses. In fact, and simultaneously, ceramics institutions, like so many others, and we can talk about that more, intertwine professional and personal experiences to the detriment of too many of their women employees and workers. For instance, as a practical matter, a workplace experience of sexual harassment or sexual assault cannot be separated from the institutional context in which it occurred. An institution may promulgate sexist personnel policies or fail to seriously discipline sexual harassment. Is it any surprise then that institutions are rife with abusive behavior? It is almost impossible to separate the sexist messages and the underlying values of these messages promulgated by some male ceramists from the personal context in which they occur, and as we all have seen over the last year or so. For example, in their social media or in their homes, from the professional context in which these men work. Too few of these men leave their discriminatory or abusive personal behaviors at the job site door. As Gail Kendall noted in her 1991 article for Studio Potter, when change has occurred, it is in response to protests or when protest is brought to bear on sensitive institutions. It is left to the women and the right-thinking men who join them to combat this bad behavior. In an important book, Against Our Will, published in 1975, writer Susan Brown Miller defined the idea of rape as, quote, a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear, not as a matter of an uncontrollable urge to have sex. Notably, for the generation of women ceramists who came of age then, including Gail, the publication of Against Our Will fostered advocacy by them and their politicized sisters like me of beneficial changes in laws regarding rape and domestic violence just as today's activists seek more changes in laws that punish sexual assault. Thus, today's Me Too movement was born in this community and everywhere. U.S. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell fathered it. Quote from Mr. McConnell, Senator Elizabeth Warren was giving a lengthy speech. She had appeared to violate the rule, a very obscure rule, very rarely enforced. She was warned. She was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted. The Twitterverse roared back. For instance, I'm shocked at how Senate Majority Leader treated Senator Warren last night, said no woman ever. The memeverse roared back too. Quote, she was warned, she was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted. Written below a picture of civil rights hero Rosa Parks sitting at the front of the bus. She was warned, she was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted, was written underneath a picture of Darth Vader towering over Princess Leia, pointing a finger at her and lecturing her. Excuse me. Since those reprehensible remarks were made by Senator McConnell, the Me Too movement has called out the long-standing abusive behavior of dozens of powerful men, not all famous, but now all justly infamous. Me Too activists in the ceramics community have called out lauded male ceramists and professors. Fill in that blank for yourself. Then remind yourself to testify, to persist, to resist every day, for that's how change happens. Ceramic, you can clap. And we could talk more about this, talk more about this. Ceramics genius Betty Woodman commented on this long-standing problem of sexism in the ceramics world when she began her practice over half a century ago. In an interview with her, The Guardian newspaper wrote, as a female artist starting out in the 1950s, it was not always an easy ride for Woodman. She fell in love with clay as a teenager, and her family supported her decision to become a potter, but the ceramics world was not always so welcoming. Quote, this is Betty talking, at the beginning, people were quick to dismiss me or not take me seriously, she said. Back then, the world of ceramics was totally male-dominated. It was a very macho world. If you weren't willing to be one of the boys, it was very difficult to be a part of it. Woodman went on to say, but I'm a little combative, so I guess I also enjoyed it. But here's the point, and I know from others who've told me about Betty, I've never had the pleasure to meet her. But why should any woman need to be combative to receive equal treatment anywhere, any place, any time? If you weren't willing to be one of the boys, it was very difficult to be a part of it. Sadly, I continue to hear such accounts, as I'm sure you all do as well or have experienced them yourself. Sadly, it was only in 2018 that the first Equality Clay Day was declared, advisedly, going back to where I started this talk, on the day marking U.S. women's federal suffrage. Yes, she can characterizes the movement from Me Too declarations to she persisted action. Today, we campaign to end discriminatory and gendered power dynamics in the institutions of the ceramics world and in the behavior of male ceramists who don't know better, or should know better, to end all of it. Today, women ceramists seek that executive power that we don't have. Today, Equal Clay Day is every day. Thank you. So we're going to now examine this issue, as I said, of the intertwining of institutional discrimination and individual experience of a sexist from the perspectives of three fabulous women who I have two of whom I know well, one of whom I've had the recent pleasure to meet. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read the three bios, and then they will come up in order of their bio presentations. So Adrienne Spinozzi, Angelica Pozo, and Lawton. Adrienne is Assistant Research Curator of American Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She is currently organizing two ceramic exhibitions, one on mid-19th century stoneware from the Edgefield District of South Carolina, and another on the Robert A. Ellison Jr. collection of modern and contemporary American and European ceramics. Angelica Pozo, we realized before we've known each other half our lives, and there's no gray hair, so that started when we were 13. No, not really. Angelica Pozo is a full-time, self-employed ceramic artist in Cleveland, Ohio. She divides her time among public art commissions, studio work, writing how-to books, teaching ceramics workshops, and teaching in K-12 schools, often serving as an artist in residence on large participatory tile and mosaic projects in school and community settings. Ann Lawton is a mixed media artist, registered art therapist, and an art educator. She works with a variety of populations in western Wisconsin and eastern Minnesota. She is a faculty member in the art department at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. So as I mentioned, each of our panelists is going to make a presentation, and then we're going to turn to a discussion among them. So please welcome the three of them, beginning with Adrienne.
First, a little about me. I don't know many of you. I have a background in studio art. I studied ceramics at Hartwick College with Roberta Griffith, and I then followed my undergraduate studies in South Korea, where I was a Fulbright scholar, again working with ceramics. All this to say I have an understanding of the material. I have a love of clay, like all of you, and I think it really directed my future endeavors in graduate school. I focused on ceramic history in graduate school, and I really was looking at the ways in which women ceramic artists of the early 20th century were trying to gain their economic independence. So it's an interesting look about a century earlier to some of the challenges and struggles we're still dealing with today. And the image I show you here is of Sadie Irvine. This is a decorator and educator at Newcomb Pottery. She was working at Newcomb College. She was the longest reigning decorator at Newcomb, and I was looking at her life in terms of what other things she had to do to make it work for her to be able to make pottery. The next slide is a photograph of women modelers at the Groovy Pottery. Groovy was located outside of Boston in Massachusetts. And again, looking at the ways in which the art potteries of the early 20th century were operating. All the women you see here, all the modelers, were paid by the piece. This was strictly sort of across the board with all of the thriving art potteries of that period. Whereas the male, you can see him, I think. You can see the man standing in the background. All the men supervisors and designers, they were all paid a salary. So they were very much secure in their positions, whereas the women at that time were having to figure out what to do. Oh, hold on, I'm just gonna go back. And so in addition to looking at all the works from that period, what they looked like, how they were made, the different philosophies that informed the designs, I sought to understand the divisions of labor and the professional obstacles that define these artists' experiences. And this is really an often overlooked aspect of the arts and crafts period, and it's one that really resonated with me, and I think their struggles are as timely as ever today. I continue to be motivated by these types of issues. As someone who approaches objects as a means to explore social and cultural histories and stories, I could not have found a more fulfilling career as a curator of American ceramics. And I stand here today, I know I'm very, very fortunate. I'm a curator of ceramics at the Met. And I know that there are many advantages and opportunities that come with my position, and certainly that come with working in a large cultural institution. But like many of you, I too encounter obstacles that are deeply rooted in the museum field at large, including notions and misconceptions of privilege, sexism, discrimination, and of course, ingrained hierarchies that are continuing to really be obstacles for all of us. And in no way do I want to minimize or draw attention away from other biases and forms of discrimination that are very inherent in the museum field. There are many. They are, they're really important to sort of acknowledge and understand, and I hope that we can address them. They're profound. But I'm here today to speak of my experiences, and I can only really present that to you. I can't really speak about others' experiences. I learned a valuable lesson early in my career at the Met. In 2007, I was hired as a research associate. I was asked to help with a large reinstallation of American glass and ceramics. Our permanent collection, we were reinstalling our courtyard at the Met. And it was a dream job. I had just finished graduate school. I was a ceramics major in college, went to graduate school for ceramic history, and so how could I pass up this opportunity? The pay was low, really low. I had a part-time job. I lived with 2 roommates in a 1-bedroom apartment. There was a lot of optimism on my part and maybe some unrealistic expectations for how I was going to make it work. But I took the position because how could I pass it up? About a year and a half later, a young man in the department, he was our departmental intern, was offered a full-time position at the same title that I had. So we shared an office, and incredulously he asked me, how can you live on this salary? In doing so, and sort of asking me how he was going to figure it out, how he was going to make it work, he shared that his pay was about 20% more than what I was making. You're not surprised. No one should be surprised. To my supervisor's credit, I sort of walked right over and said, look, what am I going to do? How can I, knowing this, I mean, I took the job, I was doing the job, but knowing that somebody with less experience who was just hired was making more than me, 20% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're making very little, it's a lot. And to her credit, she went to the head of the department. My salary was adjusted very quickly. But it was not lost on me that it wasn't because somebody said, oh, Adrienne, you're doing a great job. You deserve more compensation. It was solely because they couldn't deny the blatant and obvious discrimination. So recently, I was reminiscing, preparing for this talk, I called him. He's now a director of strategic planning at a major New York City institution, cultural institution. He sort of skyrocketed. He was shocked. He remembered the conversation. This was 2008, maybe. He remembered it well. It was his first job offer right out of graduate school. But he had no idea about the discrepancy in salary. I did not share that with him at the time. He remembered that in that whole transition, when he was hired, he was given a new office. I stayed in the little office we shared. He also remembered that he went around to other curators in the department and said, this isn't right. I was just given a job. There are many people who should have this new office. And they said, look, you can't do anything about it. And so he knew it was wrong. He felt that it was wrong, but he also felt that he couldn't do anything about it. And so I share that because we were all sort of wrapped up in this system of injustices. As fortunate as I was to experience this early in my career, or as unfortunate, sorry, I feel like my eyes have been opened a little bit. But this is not uncommon. This happens across the board. There are many, many stories like this. Talk to anyone, really. But its impact affects us at every level. Senior curators and mentors of mine are sympathetic, but I have to say it's to a degree. They are always quick to remind me that they had it much worse. And no doubt, I know it was worse, probably in the 70s and 80s. I know it was, but it does not mean that we can continue to ignore and excuse these systemic injustices that can continue to perpetuate the insidious problems facing our field. Despite these very real issues at museums and cultural institutions, both large and small, meaningful efforts are underway. For the first time in the history of the American wing at the Met, we are under the leadership of a woman. Her name is Sylvia Yunt. Sylvia's focus is to bring new perspectives to American art, bring these perspectives and new narratives to the fore. This redressing of the canon includes exhibiting works by indigenous artists, collecting works by artists of diverse backgrounds, including people of color, and offering a greater representation of work by women in our galleries. Also a first for us is a curatorial team of all women, and I should just underscore this, it's all white women. This is maybe noteworthy for the American wing at the Met, but it's not unique in our field. We are predominantly female and we're predominantly white. Not surprisingly, the balance shifts the higher one advances in the field. One only has to survey museum directors and administrators, department heads, to see there's an overwhelming percentage of men in leadership positions. I want to end this brief little introduction by sharing some of my current work. One of the most exciting projects I'm working on is a stoneware exhibition of 19th century stoneware made in Edgefield District, South Carolina. The objects in the show, a few of which you see on the screen, will be presented in a completely new light. The focus, instead of the glazes and the potters who own the potteries, the focus will be on the contributions of the enslaved potters whose labor enabled this stoneware industry to develop and prosper. This exhibition will bring attention to this important yet often overlooked aspect of ceramic history. Another project of mine is the acquisition and forthcoming exhibition of 20th and 21st century ceramics from the Robert A. Ellison Jr. collection, a very small selection of which you see here on the screen, and I think some of these works might be familiar to some of you. The story of American ceramics is a history of accomplishments by women potters, teachers, designers, decorators, who persevered and succeeded in an overwhelmingly male-dominated environment. This gift, it's pretty significant for the Met. It will allow us to bring these histories to light, to identify these artists, to celebrate them, and it will fill longstanding gaps in the museum's collection. We all acknowledge that there's so much work to be done here. There's a lot to do. There are many problems that we're all facing, and I want to leave you with 3 things that I feel are really important as we look to advancing these discussions. The first is a call to all of you in positions of power and leadership to do the hard but necessary work involved. Efforts to address implicit and explicit biases require an honest review of ingrained practices and behaviors, and it really has to begin at the top. You have to be committed. The first step is providing an environment where people can share their experiences so that voices can be heard and meaningful action taken. The Met is currently engaged in developing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility strategies. However, a thorough and transparent review of salary equity is not yet part of that process. The second point, and one that affects all of us here and all of us regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, age, and class, is to ensure that your staff is compensated fairly. A recent article from the Gender Equity in Museums movement, a group committed to raising this very issue, recommends performing an equity salary audit. There is no better way to gauge whether your organization is living up to its principles of providing a fair and equitable workplace. And the third is a call to all of us here, and really all of us in our various institutions and colleges and organizations, to support one another. You've heard this before: empowered women empower women. The importance of mentorship, of providing opportunities for growth. These cannot be overstated. Recognize and support the vulnerable and marginalized among us, and stand with those who are speaking up and demanding action. They need support too. A supportive, encouraging, professional community is essential, and it really does make a difference. Thank you.
Good
morning, everyone. Again, my name is Lawton. I am an artist, I am an art therapist, and I'm an art educator, and I will be the individual that is facilitating the breakout session at 1 o'clock this afternoon in M100I on the mezzanine level. It's an art-based storytelling format for those of us who want to share in a collective to express our hardships and our truths. And the breakout session is called The Truths We Share. So please come join me at 1 o'clock in M100I. So before I get into my main points today, I just want to take a time out, and I'd like you to kind of play along with me for a moment, and I'm going to lead you through a brief visualization that we'll come back to later in my remarks. But what I'd like you to do now is just take some time, and I'd like you to imagine a ceramic cup in your mind. Should be easy since we're here at NCECA. Ample sources of inspiration. I want you to imagine this cup, and any cup is fine. And as you're imagining it, I want you to think of its weight, its details, its volume, its mass, its form. And while you're imagining this cup, I want you to hold it in your mind for now, and we'll come back to that cup shortly. So my background, I have 3 intersections that inform the work that I do and the work that I advocate for, being an artist, being an art therapist, working with various populations, and then being an arts educator teaching at UW River Falls in the art department. So I'm here to talk about the not so fun stuff with regards to how the long-term effects of misogyny and sexism within the woman experience and also marginalized populations is long-term. So our culture story informs our family story, which thus informs our personal story. Our inference about our values and the norms that we have to navigate through, how we work with others. The culture story is seen as this unseen cultural effect that impacts women's lives and how they have been treated in society because they are women, but equally so how men are expected to act in said society as well. Our family story is an ongoing narrative passed down from one generation to the next about social and gender expectations and belief. And our self-stories, that self-actualization is never really reached, but we're always working towards it. But it's continuing to always be pieced together, and ultimately our foundations for this come from our culture and our family story. So typically within our culture story and family stories, women are expected to be the emotional laborers. So this being said, emotional labor is the extortion of energy for the purpose of addressing people's feelings, making them feel comfortable with living and being interactive in social experiences. Thus, doing all that emotional labor, it depletes us and drains our emotional resources. For example, just a few to wrap your head around. I'm sure these are all very relatable. Colleagues or friends, strangers even, offloading problems to you and expecting an immediate response. And just FYI, kind women are not your therapists. Or when men who use you for professional gain to, pick your brain for ideas with no pay or compensation, ultimately using your work and knowledge to advance themselves. How we are expected to mediate conflict at work, at home, with our families, in our social circles. We are responsible to keep the conversation going in discussions and meetings. We are the ones to always have to ask the questions. Another example that I'd like to discuss here with regards to emotional labor and gender bias, specifically within academia, is that of student evaluations. Mounting research has shown that women, as well as marginalized populations who are either adjuncts or even tenure professors, receive significantly lower rated evaluations. And this is because these evaluations are biased and often do not relate in any way to course objectives. Students, in reflection of the course, are writing in and filling out these evaluations with typically systemic biases. You know, the male professors that show leadership, but when a woman does the same, we're a bitch. Or they'll be commented about how we dress or how the sound of our voice is annoying or shrill, that we're too demanding. So then, when these evaluations are then connected to promotions, raises, tenure, who gets hired? Who gets those promotions? And this is a little too much for me right now as a recent memory in one particular instance that is still fresh in my mind, where someone was hired down to teaching evaluations. So then, how can our mental health not be affected by all of this? Of course, this is a rhetorical question. The patriarchal structures that have been embedded in the consciousness and unconsciousness of women, resulting in the following. These are just a few. This is the short list. Learned helplessness, low self-esteem, depression, acute stress and anxiety, the fear of abuse, insecure attachment issues, imposter syndrome, and post-traumatic stress disorder. These are the pervasive realities that women, people of color, LGBTQ individuals experience and yet are ignored about every single day, let alone the access about mental health services, the access affordability. That's its whole other panel discussion. So let's go back to that cup in your mind. You got that in your mind now? I'm coming back to it. Your cup's allowed to change. Don't feel like you have to be fixated on the same cup. I want you to imagine this cup being dropped. Time and time again. This cup is being dropped at various heights, onto various surfaces, over and over time, sometimes on accident, sometimes out of habit, sometimes the cup is thrown with force. The damage starts, maybe not seen at first, with a few first gentle falls. But then, of course, the structural integrity starts to change. The chips are made visible with each interaction, dropped or thrown, cracks in the surface, and the ability to function are ignored. And this cup is expected to function the same, if not better, than ever. Why would we expect this cup to function the same after what it's been through? The cup you are imagining was not selected for you to envision because it's delicate. Because women and other marginalized populations are not delicate. We are resilient. This cup isn't a metaphor for the physical self or our bodies. It's a metaphor for women's mental health and long-term effects. That each cup, each instance that this cup is being dropped, kicked off a ledge, over and over, represents the gender bias, emotional labor, our generational stories, even the stories we tell ourselves, our own internalized misogyny that can be seen in this form of this cup. And in closing, our sense of self, our value, identity, our value, our sense of worth, our relationships to others, our boundaries are constantly being moved. We're just expected to know. We are in a state of constant confusion, and we, of course, are to blame. As local Minnesota rapper and song writer Dessa so poetically states in her song Fire Drills, I think a woman's worth that she deserves a better line of work than motherfucking vigilance. Thank you.
We're now going to invite Angelica to give her presentation, and I want everyone to know that we're then going to go immediately to a conversation among our entire group here, and if we run out of questions or comments, we'll then go back to some discussion with the panel. So I hope you'll stick with us, and Angelica, your turn.
This field of ceramics has offered me the opportunity to mold a fulfilling career and to work with some wonderful people. Through that journey, I have encountered many women working in the field of the arts who have been helpful and supportive, and I am honored and humbled to now be offered opportunity to pay that forward and see how my experiences can be of help and inspiration to other women as they enter the field and begin to mold their own careers in clay. So thank you, Rebecca, for the invitation. Thank you, Chipstone, for supporting, and for NCECA for providing this platform. So this is my Yes She Can and Yes She Did story. Watching over us is BFA-aged Angelica donning an Angela Davis-sized flower power afro, which I found fitting to represent my talk today. This was in Alfred, and we had just walked through the Ag Tech School, and greenhouses is across the street from Alfred, and came upon all these flowers from a flowering arranging class that was in the trash. We took them back to the studio, and that's the kiln room roof, I think, behind me. So there she is. So watching the Me Too and the Time's Up movement unfold, seeing all the stories that many shared for the first time in their lives, and now being invited on this panel has moved me to reflect upon my personal experience as a woman and how my gender has affected my career through the years. Thinking back, I've certainly had to endure my share of misogynistic behavior, but it feels like it was mostly long ago. Actually, I feel pretty good right now in terms of how I am perceived as a woman artist in my local and greater arts community. I do not feel that my career has been held back or restricted in any way because of my gender. So how did I get to this place where I feel professionally successful in my own feminine skin? Thinking back to my formative years, my parents were very supportive of their only child. They sent me to all-girls Catholic boarding school for middle and high school to keep me from getting into trouble on the streets of New York as I was coming of age. But even in that protective and supportive cloister, I was able to see that in the real world outside, women and people of color were not in the same footing as the white patriarchy that dominated society. It was the 60s and the 70s, time of Vietnam War, protests and revolts against the establishment. And that establishment was very white, very male, and older. In my teens, I do specifically remember thinking that as a female and a person of color, I would have to work twice as hard to prove myself, to be able to get to where I wanted to be in life. As harsh of a reality as that may have been for me as a young teen, I do recall welcoming the challenge. I was proud to be an Afro-Latina, and I did not let those perceptions of obstacles ahead get me down or deter my resolve to persevere. Later during college, in the mid-70s, my female classmates and I would note that all the art classes were filled with predominantly women students, yet professors and department heads were almost exclusively male. We would find similar ratios when considering the rosters of major ceramic gallery exhibitions. In retrospect, this shouldn't have come as much of a surprise for that time, as universities were part of that establishment I mentioned above. So of course, faculty hired and artwork chosen would generally reflect the institution's narrow self-image and values. The same can be said of much of the landscape of the 20th century contemporary arts world. It was certainly a man's world, but it wouldn't be nothing without a woman or a girl. I can't help it, it's my karaoke tune. So, women of color would have been hard-pressed to find the few, if any, reflections of themselves within the contemporary ceramics institutions of the time. Pre-mid-20th century, a woman's place in the ceramics world was primarily as a decorator in the art pottery factories like Rookwood. Women did not normally take part in the forming of clay. It was not until later in the century that you start seeing women getting recognized within the arena of contemporary clay. Ceramics has long had its predominantly male mentors. Looking back though, pre-mid-20th century, American ceramics we would find a long string of revered men and conjure up images of humble masters at their crafts, generously sharing the Zen-like wisdom of their years in clay. In the mid-20th century, that male-dominated ceramic world went into macho man overdrive with the emergence of Peter Voulkos. Creating his massive throne and stacked aggressively altered forms did take a lot of hard work and physical strength, which he loved to flamboyantly show off during his well-attended demos. Voulkos gained rock star status. His influence, I remember, did give us, generally in the ceramics, for the freedom to do more sculptural things and more artistic, and kind of brought us into the 21st century of contemporary art world. However, it did kind of add a layer of machismo to the good old clay boys club foundation that dominated much of contemporary ceramic institutions of the time. I remember that it wasn't so much the teachers that I was working with. I felt that the teachers were not at that stage, but it was my fellow students, and then some of the going to NCECAs and some of the energies that everybody was, how much clay can you center? There was all this sort of emphasis to this masculine drive that I just wasn't that into. So this was all frustrating reality, which most likely influenced my decision to not actively pursue a college teaching job upon receiving my MFA from the University of Michigan in 1978. Instead, I stayed in Ann Arbor for a few years and kept my options open. In 1984, I moved to Cleveland, Ohio to see if I can start my arts career in clay. An affordable shared studio space had opened up, plus similarities I found with my hometown of New York City and the great work of the Ohio Arts Council are the three things I cite as my reasons to take a chance on Cleveland, and has then turned out to be a good gamble for me. Through trials and errors, feasts and famines, and a lot of hard work, I had been able to craft a varied and stimulating career for myself as a self-employed artist in Cleveland. That career spans working on big public art commissions to leading participants in participating community art projects. I started a neighborhood artist in residency program within my community, and I share my studio with my neighbors and work with that. I also times teaching ceramics workshops. More often, I have worked as an artist teacher in K-12 schools, doing tile murals, as Rebecca mentioned. But ever keeping it flexible, I have recently been doing shorter school workshops and a lot of after-school programs. In between all that, I try to squeeze out as much time as possible for my own studio. I do own my own house and studio. My mortgage is paid off. My house has, my house has 3 apartments, so I live in one and get rental income from the other 2. So things are starting to look pretty stable. I'm gonna have some debt to get rid of, but things are feeling good. So the intention is to have all these different income streams ebb and flow, and ideally the right overlapping times to keep me covered when projects end or a particular stream dries out. It doesn't always quite match up, but things seem to work out eventually. This many irons and many fires approach to self-employment has been a bit frazzling at times, but I wouldn't have it any other way, because most of the time it is quite satisfying and rewarding work that I do get to do. Generally, I have felt free to control what I choose to work on, whom I choose to work with or to work for. I am my own boss. This is a very empowering thing, and I owe a big part of that empowerment to my life focused around play and the arts. I've charted my own course, and I certainly did it my way, but not the smug Frank Sinatra way, more the Nina Simone version. If you've not heard it, you should look it up. In her version, there's this beat that's this kind of driving beat. It's like, I must not stop, I cannot stop, I must keep going. And I just love it. It's my theme song. Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. I did what I had to do, and I saw it through without exemption. I planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway, and more, much more than this, I did it my way. For what has a woman, what has she got, if not herself? Or she has not to say and do and make the things that she truly feels, and not the words of one who kneels to misogynist and racist attitudes and systems. So ladies, let's face it all. Let me hear ya. Let's all stand tall and do it our way.
Y'all can see why I love Angelica, as you will now too if you hadn't yet. We're going to devote the rest of our time here to a dialogue. In the interest of fairness and opportunity, I want to ask those who come to the mics, if you have a question for the panel, they are, as you can see, such special people, or for me. Our goal here is to educate each other through these questions as opposed to making rhetorical statements. There's plenty of other chances for that, but not a lot of chances to talk with our wonderful panelists. So I'm happy to recognize people who come up to the mics, or if you want to raise your hand, but I want to make sure we hear you when you speak.
There are a lot of young people in here, and you've said a lot of great words for people in positions of power. So my question is for any of the panelists who would like to answer. But if you could have told your younger self something, what would it have been? What do you wish you would have known?
I often do a practice with clients as well as students writing letters to our former selves, which is really emotional. And I do this typically once a year with myself, and consistently, time after time, what I would have told even myself 10 years ago is, you really can't care what men think at all. I mean, objectively, but about my appearance, about my attitude, about my disposition, just let that shit go.
Adrienne or Angelica?
You know what's right. And if something doesn't feel right to you, if you feel that you are being taken advantage of, or you feel that you feel that you're deserving of something that you're not getting, you have to speak up. And I think that it's taken me a little while. I'm still in the process, but I think it's really important. You have to advocate for yourself, and I think that people then will treat you differently. And so I think that is sort of advice that can probably be applied to many different situations. But I think that as young women, and I still consider myself, I mean, in the curatorial field, I'm very, very junior, and I know that. But I think that people can go through their entire careers feeling that they haven't gotten to their potential because they sort of held back. And I think that all of us can, we know what we deserve, we know what's right, we know, you have to go and ask for it, and you have to sort of, you've got to just maybe put yourself in those uncomfortable positions and situations to get what you deserve.
I guess I would say, because I've kind of like, I went through a big battle, but I guess I would reassure myself to just keep following your instincts and keep on going and just don't give up. Do follow your heart.
I would just to say, to answer the question, because I haven't heard the word yet this morning, and it's, maybe I said it, but I don't think I did. It's the word power. And I was not taught as a young woman, nor during the course of my career, that in order to achieve what I was capable of achieving and wanted to achieve, not to mention the women around me wanted to achieve, that I had to believe in the idea of my power, and not so much as a self-actualization or self-care or those kinds of things, but my power to influence institutions to change, and my power to work hard to change men's attitudes. So I think something I would have told my younger self is take that to heart and share that with other women and make sure that you do that. And as you heard, particularly from Adrienne, that's what is required. Yes, ma'am.
I'd just like to make a comment. I'm 75, and it's taken me 70 years to understand if it's not my job, I don't have to do it.
Yes.
And I have observed younger people that I identify with who take on too many projects. Their job needs it to be done, but they become burned out. Avoid being burned out. Know when you have to go to your boss and say, I can't do it. Can we get other help? It's very important to be in a conversation with the people you work with and not fester. And
Thank you.
I wonder if anybody else has had that experience. Thank you.
Yeah, and I've learned that no is a complete sentence, that I don't need to
justify
offer an explanation about my self-care and in my profession. I don't have to prove myself to anyone anymore. It feels like when I was just starting out as a young professional, I had to say yes to everything, it felt like. And I think in a way that paid off, because now I can say no. And I wish I would have learned that sooner. So I wholeheartedly agree with your sentiments. Thank you.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think it's a constant, it continues to be something that we all have to negotiate. You have to recognize your own boundaries, we all are making sacrifices no matter whatever it is we're doing. If you have a life outside of your work, which many of us do, these are all the constant little negotiations. And yes, you do not want to burn yourself out, especially if you are, you just have to figure out what works for you. And if you are really committed and you want to do something, then make that your priority and everything else will sort of fall into place.
I'm a pre-service educator who's going to be working in Chicago and just accepted a job as a program director at a summer camp in Pennsylvania for an all-girls sleepaway camp. So my question is, how would you talk about these issues in the classroom when you're looking at a class that is solely women and then looking at a class that is co-ed, and like what differences you would address, like what different issues you address and how you would address them differently?
I don't think the issues differ. The issue of sexism is just that, right? The issue of bad behavior is just that. The issue of institutional powers applied inappropriately is just that. To me, I think I have taught in both mixed classes and all women's contexts. I think that's what's different in the latter is the importance of doing some of what we talked about and you and Angelica sung about, right? I did it my way, I figured it out, right? And what's important for the men to hear, and we had some chance to talk about this in the planning of this session, is you can be allies. And if you're not an ally, you ought to be. But you're not a leader of this movement, you're an ally of this movement. And to the extent that your own behavior is inappropriate, you need to get real and fix it. And I think that that applies to both boys and girls at a fairly young age because, as we all know, these attitudes are formed early and then they stick.
The only difference would be to be especially encouraging in the all-girls situation, to be especially encouraging but as Rebecca says, I think you pretty much have to cover the same material, but But within an all-girls context, you have that comfort of being able to talk about some issues that might be a little bit more uncomfortable in a co-ed situation with younger kids. So you are able to maybe go into a little bit more issues with an all-girls group, and then you'd be able to have them speak also more comfortably in an all-girls group than a co-ed. But I think you do have to cover it.
In case you have some doubt about what's appropriate, think about applying the same criteria to discussions among men and women or only women and what the issues are, how you would think about those situations as, say, in my case, as a white person working with people of color. Would I presume, for instance, to lead a session that was primarily devoted to issues of race and ethnicity? No, I don't think I would.
I was really inspired by the panel. I'm currently on the board of a studio back in Boston, and the whole place is run by women, which is amazing. Executive director, vice chair, president, the board. And so I'm curious, how could we bring a discussion like this to our studio and talk about the uniqueness of our studio, and then also recognizing that while we are unique in our leadership of women, or women leadership, but we do still play into the misogyny and patriarchalness.
Continuously, it's about having an open dialogue, and we tend to use the word confrontation as a bad descriptor, but confrontation is where that learning and that threshold happens. So being able to have difficult discussions about inclusivity, about checking privilege, about who are you citing as your experts, for example, the past 2 years, I've shown exclusively only female artists of color and queer artists in my slides. Nobody's noticed. But I think it's a conscious choice about what it is, what sources, who are you sourcing, who are your experts in your field that you can draw from that are women or from marginalized populations, and having an open dialogue about that.
One other thing I would point out to you, just as a way of organizing the process, there's a wonderful national project. It's called Gender Avenger. It's started by a woman named Gina Glantz, who has a really storied history as a leader of the women's movement going back to the 60s, I think. But they have a very specific agenda, which is to make sure and call out when institutions, regardless of type, are not including women on the panels at all. You would be surprised how frequently that happens. And we're talking major institutions, Fortune 500 companies, and when there are too few. And the idea there, as it relates to what you asked, is to make sure that not only do you deal with the issues that Ann was mentioning, but that you make sure that the people who talk about diversity and who talk about these issues of power and sexism and discrimination are at least as many of them are women and people of color, if not more, than men. I think that's the point about the slides that's just so important.
I personally connected with Adrienne's statement of being labeled a bossy bitch when I was working in an office, and when my male colleagues, when they had to be an enforcer, were labeled as decisive and committed and
yes.
Authoritative. I was just wondering to you all, how do you navigate that in your own careers, and do female colleagues perpetuate those kinds of biases and stereotypes?
So there's two questions here, both really important. Thank you. One is, how do you navigate sexist approaches? And the second is how to build an alliance with your women colleagues so you're not fighting over the tidbits, but instead getting the large piece of the pie.
So I think that we just all have to get used to acting like that. And we're not being bossy bitches. We're just asking for what we feel is right and what we deserve. And it might not be comfortable for those around us, but I think if we continue to stand up for ourselves and to advocate for what we feel we deserve, people will fall into place. I think that people will start to be more comfortable and recognize that we're just asking for the same thing that our male colleagues are asking for. I think that when the structures are maybe evolve a bit more and you see more women in power, we won't care how we come off, because I think they'll understand. Or it's not that we're asking for things from our male supervisors, or that they are the ones in power anymore.
Reclaiming that word bitch, like, as a positive. There's some Amy Poehler, Tina Fey skit where Tina Fey says, bitches get shit done. And it's true. And so also, like, with female students or even female clients that I have, where I'm sorry to bother you, I'm sorry to, and I say, quit apologizing for existence.
Don't say sorry anymore.
Yeah.
That's the one thing.
And I guess specifically in the Midwest, it's very Midwestern to apologize for every little inconvenience, is to stop apologizing for taking up space and being who you are. And so also within interacting with men in departments and men in various fields, keep on rising to the challenge. And again, don't do the emotional labor, and they will be startled. It's amazing when they're not gonna do the work for me. That things will start, you gotta be persistent. Persistence and follow through is key.
So I'm going to add one other thing to this, and this relates to my own experience as a political organizer, and that is the power comes in numbers. It doesn't come by being the queen bee or the only woman in the room and automatically the guys turn to you and they listen to you. They don't. And they may momentarily if they think you're attractive or something like that, but that doesn't last. What does last is, I don't use this word bitch, but I would say what does last is women coming together, strong women coming together and working this system. So if they're all perceived as bossy, well then the institutional players are gonna have to take another look and deal with this differently. And I would also say, and speak personally for a moment, I've been married for 46 years and have been through this process as a wife as well as a professional woman. And I think for those of us who choose that path, it's really important to share that information with other women, because it is possible to be both a feminist and a wife of a man and to work together on these matters. So I just want to say that out loud. I see one of my good male friends in the house who knows my husband well, but in all seriousness, I want to say that because it hasn't yet been said.
I'm 6 weeks away from getting my MFA in ceramics, and I will be the only female to graduate from that program. And it's because of that systemic misogynistic issue that is just so under the radar. And I'm wondering, my question to you is, with 6 weeks left, do I challenge this? Do I talk about it, or I just keep my head down and get out?
I guess what are you up for? What are you up to, how you feel? How you feeling?
I'm intimidated.
You feel intimidated?
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's up to your own comfort level. You could just put your head down and get out and make your own better world outside of there. Depends on what battle you want to fight.
And you'll have other opportunities once you graduate, right? I mean, your path forward is not going to, your experiences, whatever you've experienced, aren't going to stop here.
I'm an MFA student as well, and I do mostly clay-based performance art. Not all the time, but a lot of the time I'm also using my body and other female bodies in the nude. My clay professors often remark that I'm trying to be shocking, or that they don't know how to talk about feminism or intersectional feminism, but that they can talk about the craft. So I wonder, since we're talking about institutions, where can we intersect with art departments, institutions, to make it a requirement that they learn how to dialogue about these topics that we have here, so that way students can better exceed also.
So is there anyone at the university that you can talk to? Like the head of the department? Can you, as go right to them and say, this isn't really working. I don't feel that I'm supported in what I want to do, and it's because of this.
I try, and then because I'm so assertive, I often get that sort of bitchiness, because I'm the only one talking.
So I'm going to take the liberty, just in the interest of time and honoring everyone's schedule, to encourage those who haven't had a chance to chat with the panelists. They'll be here for a bit, and with me. And to thank again John and Chipstone for being so generous in providing this opportunity. Thanks again to Josh and Rhonda for contacting me and saying, let's do this. It was a really great thing to have done. So thank you all for coming. Please come chat with us. Please see us outside. Please talk among yourselves and organize.